Thank you all for waiting so patiently. Welcome, everyone. My name is Tam Hun. I am the Executive Director of the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine, and I am thrilled to be here with you for our very first Distinguished Lecture Series. Before we begin our program, I would like to introduce my colleague, Erica Nadelhaft. She is a Holocaust scholar and our education coordinator. So in that role, she leads our educators who present programs throughout the state of Maine on the Holocaust, anti-bias, and human rights. Erica also represents the HHRC, working with our collaborative partner, the Maine Department of Education, in expanding curriculum content areas to include the Holocaust and other genocides. Oh, and she created this distinguished lecture series. Please join me in welcoming Erica. And Erica, we're so looking forward to you guiding us through tonight's exciting program.
Thank you, Tam. Before I introduce our wonderful guest speaker tonight, just a few housekeeping details. Please keep yourselves muted throughout tonight's session. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. Please enter any questions that you have in the chat using the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will monitor the chat, and when Silvia has finished her presentation, I will pass the questions on to her when the time comes. And so now I am really so very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker. Silvia Foti is the author of the memoir, The Nazi's Granddaughter: How I Discovered My Grandfather Was a War Criminal. She's an award-winning investigative journalist in Chicago and a high school literature teacher. She holds master's degrees in journalism, education, and creative nonfiction. Silvia made a deathbed promise to her mother to write a book about her famous World War II hero grandfather, Jonas Norieka, 21 years ago. Her grandmother had begged her not to write about her husband and asked her to just let history lie. Silvia had no idea that in keeping her promise to her mother, her discoveries would bring her to her own personal crisis, challenge her Catholic faith, unearth Holocaust denial, and expose an official cover-up by the Lithuanian government. Her goal in writing this story of her grandfather is really to upend Lithuania's narrative that Lithuanians had nothing to do with killing Jews and that it was all done by German Nazis. So please join me in welcoming Silvia Foti. And Silvia, the stage is now yours.
Thank you, Erica, for that lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be here. So I will work on sharing my screen as I have a little PowerPoint to go through. And here we are. Oh, sorry. Okay. So, this is about the Nazi's granddaughter, how I discovered my grandfather was a war criminal, how I came to start the story, and what I discovered. So I thought I would just start with Lithuania. It's not a very well-known country from Europe yet. So here it is in Europe, and you can see it's surrounded by Latvia, Poland, Belarus. You can see Russia off to the east here. Germany is over here in the west. So that's where Lithuania is situated. It's a small country, about the size of the state of Virginia. Brief history of Lithuania. Started at about 1000 AD. It has lived under Polish, German, and Russians for centuries, and it had become a democratic state right after World War I in 1918, and had a brief period of freedom for 22 years. These are the years my parents were born and the years my grandparents met. My story basically starts at around World War II, with the Soviet occupation in 1940. Then the Nazis came into Lithuania in 1941, And then the communists came back in 1944 and stayed there, occupying Lithuania until 1990. Then Lithuania again became free in 1990, and now it's had 32 years of freedom. I grew up in Chicago, and I'm speaking to you today still from Chicago. Grew up in Market Park, known as Little Lithuania, and I'm standing here with my mom and her mom, my grandmother. And even though I was born in Chicago, for the first 5 years of my life, I spoke almost exclusively Lithuanian. And this is how it was in the Lithuanian community. They really wanted to preserve their Lithuanian culture as much as possible. So I went to kindergarten unable to speak English yet. And like a lot of immigrant children, I picked up on it in school right away within a few months. So it didn't take long. And I share that only to kind of explain just how Lithuanian I was when I grew up, that it was a little bubble of Lithuania. And I really did feel my parents' culture, even though I had never seen the country yet. And I wanted to give you a little brief history of the Holocaust in Lithuania before I get into my story. June 22nd, 1941, the Nazis invaded Lithuania as part of its Operation Barbarossa, and this is essentially when the Holocaust started in Lithuania. At that point, Lithuania had about 200,000 Jews, and unfortunately, Lithuania has the distinction of having killed the highest percentage of Jews in all of Europe. So 96.4% of Jews were murdered in Lithuania. And if you were Jewish in Lithuania at that time, you had a 3% chance of survival. It was the worst of all of Europe. It was even worse than in Germany. Most of the Jews also were killed in a very, very quick fashion within 6 months by December 1941. And it was done by bullets. It's a very individual, personal type of killing by bullets. There were no gas chambers in Lithuania. And Lithuania, as I said, is a really tiny country, about the size of the state of Virginia, yet it has about 200 death pits of Jews in its forests, so very bloody forests. When I grew up, I had heard a lot about Lithuanian anti-Nazi resistance, and yet in my research, I discovered that not really. There were only about 600 to 1,000 Nazis in Lithuania at the time, and at the time, many Lithuanians did own guns, and as I explained earlier, 200,000 Jews were killed by guns, many of them by Lithuanians. And during that time, even though Lithuanians did have guns, not a single Nazi was killed. So here's my grandfather in his 20s, Jonas Noreka. And I grew up hearing what a wonderful hero he was because he fought so bravely against the communists. So he died in a KGB prison in 1947 at the age of 36. So very young man. And he had been brought into the KGB prison because in 1945 to 1946, he tried to lead a rebellion against the Soviets, trying to unite all of the partisans to rebel against the communists. At that time, he called himself General Storm, even though he was just a captain in the army. But because he was trying to lead this effort, he gave himself the code name Generalas Vetra, or General Storm. And he was betrayed. Somebody had informed on him to the KGB, and that's how the KGB captured him and tortured him for about a year in their prison before he was executed by 2 bullets in 1947 and then tossed in a mass grave. So the ending of his life was very dramatic, and he died a martyr for Lithuania's freedom. Before that, he was in a Nazi concentration camp from 1943 to 1945, and I was told it was because he tried to save Jews. Before that, he was head of the Cholet district from 1941 to 1943, and this is during the Nazi occupation. So he had the highest position a Lithuanian can have in Lithuania's second largest region during the Nazi occupation. Before that, Lithuania was occupied by the Soviets briefly, and he had led an uprising against them in 1941, this 5-day uprising, and won. So Lithuania thought it would be independent, but of course the Nazis came in and occupied Lithuania, so there was no independence for Lithuania at that time. Anyway, because he fought so bravely against the communists in 1941 and again in 1945, he has a school named after him, a grammar school. He's got streets named after him, and he's got plaques in a few places and in a very famous building in Vilnius. So, I grew up looking at this picture of him in the family dining room ever since I was a little girl. It was in black and white. This is a colorized version. And sometimes when I lead these talks, I ask the audience members, how do you think that his looks had to do with contributing to this deception? And oftentimes I'll get answers like, he looks like a Hollywood movie star, or he looks like Superman, or look at those blue eyes. How could such a good looking man do such terrible things? And I do think that his good looks may have played a role in covering up what he did during the Holocaust, because it's just too difficult for Lithuanians to believe that he could have done anything this bad. In 1997, my mom received the Cross of the Vytis from President Algirdas Brazauskas. This is the highest honor anyone can receive posthumously. She received it on behalf of her father. And I'm here with my brother in the middle. This is 1997. This is mom, and these are Lithuanian dignitaries. And we were very, very proud to be there and help support my mom in receiving this high honor for her father. So I got involved in all this pretty much in the year 2000, because this was my mom's project. She was going to write the book on her father. This was her thing. And in the year 2000, she was only 60 years old. At the time, I was 38, and I was a full-time journalist at the time. And I go visit her in the hospital, and I see that she's not looking well at all. And she calls me over to her bedside and takes my hand and says, "Sylvia, you have to write the book." And of course, I knew which book she was talking about, because I had, observed her collecting all this material on her father. And she did. She collected 3,000 pages of those KGB transcripts. When he was in the KGB, he was interrogated. And say what you will about the Soviets, they recorded it. And it was in Russian, and she got it all translated into Lithuanian. She paid someone to translate the whole thing into Lithuanian. And he wrote 77 letters from the Stutthof concentration camp to his wife, my grandmother, and many of them are love letters, very lovely letters. And he wrote a fairy tale to my mom from there too. And then, of course, there's just behind me are 3 bookcases full of material that I got from her own archive on her father. So, of course, when she asked me to do this, I had said yes, because what else can you say to mom when she's dying? So mom died February 4th, the year 2000, and her mother survived her still. So very difficult time for my grandmother, for all of us. And my grandmother had another heart attack now in July 2000, so 5 months later. And now I'm standing at my grandmother's deathbed, and she takes my hand and she says, "Sylvia, what's going on with the book?" And I said, "Don't worry, Muchita, everything's going fine. I'm working on it. I've started going through the material, brought everything over to my house now." And I thought I was giving her words of comfort. and she says, to my shock, don't write the book. Just let history lie. There's no need to dig around. And I did not understand this comment at the time, and I thought she was just trying to give me a pass because the book sort of stressed my mom out for years, and maybe she thought it would stress me out. And I thought she was just trying to give me a pass. So anyway, she did die shortly after that, and they both wanted to be buried back in Lithuania, back in the homeland. They had talked about this all their lives. And so my brother and I were tasked with bringing their remains back to Lithuania. And we chose the date October 8th, 2000, because it would have been the 90-year memorial of our grandfather. And, we thought we'd finally reunite them, at least in death, the father, the mother, and the daughter. Um, so a lot of people attended the funeral because General Storm is such a hero in Lithuania. And you could see that over here on the right is Lithuania's first president, Vytautas Landsbergis. So when he showed up, we were very, very honored that he came to pay his respects to General Storm, his wife and his daughter. And so that was the funeral event. And then shortly after that, my brother and I were escorted to this building in Vilnius because they had just put up this plaque days before our arrival. And they wanted this plaque up there for my brother and I to visit. And this is today the Wroblewski Library. At the time, in the 1940s, it was the Academy of Sciences. And this is where my grandfather worked as a lawyer during the time that he was trying to lead this rebellion against the Soviets, 1945 to 1946. So the plaque says, in this building, 1945 to 1946, worked a noteworthy resistor, Lithuania's National Council and Lithuania's Armed Forces organizer and leader, Jonas Noreika, General Storm, shot February 26, 1947. So then we came to visit the school named after my grandfather, the Jonas Noreika Grammar School, which was renamed in the 1990s. And you can see in that middle panel, it says Noreika's Gimtinė, Noreika's birthplace, 1 kilometer away. So you can see it's kind of like this tourist attraction. And so here's the school on the left, and then on the right, a rock with another plaque of him, people visiting the school and paying their honors and respect. And on this day, I sort of lost my innocence because, we were greeted very grandly by all the students. They were holding flowers and singing Lithuanian songs. And, we honestly felt like rock stars there, that we were the grandchildren of the school's namesake. And then the director takes us into his office and we're talking for a bit. And I asked him, how did you decide to name the school after my grandfather? And this is where he says, well, before we had this horrible Russian name because Lithuania was occupied by the Russians until 1990. And as soon as Lithuania got its independence again, we wanted to name it after a good Lithuanian person. And since your grandfather was born here and he was such a magnificent hero, it was a natural to name the school after him. And I thought that would be the end of the story. But then he pulls me to the side and he says, but I got a lot of grief over naming the school after your grandfather. And I said, grief from who? And he says, the Jews. And I said, what could the Jews possibly say about my wonderful, magnificent grandfather, whom I love so much? And he looks at me as if I'm the strange one, because apparently it was common knowledge. And he says he was accused of killing Jews. And I had never heard that before, in my time in Chicago ever. Nobody ever mentioned this to me. But apparently it was pretty common knowledge. And so, but for me, I was devastated. I needed to sit down and kind of catch my breath. And I do have a little excerpt that I thought I would read from the book, just to share this with you. So it's on page 61, and it is about this moment, this key moment where it kind of all started for me. It's chapter 8, A Tarnished Halo. My brother and I were delighted to arrive at the Jonas Noreka Grammar School. It was a modest white brick building with oak trim. Hundreds of children must have run through its halls and sat in its classrooms, learning about my grandfather's World War II exploits, as we had done at our grandmother's feet. Viktoras Lešmanskas, imposing in his decorated Lithuanian Air Force uniform, had arranged for our welcome as honorary guests. We had been asked to distribute prizes to the winners of the student races held to mark our grandfather's 90th birthday. The school director, Boleslavas Talat-Kelpsha, a stout man with disheveled white hair, grasped our hands energetically, saying how pleased he was that we had come to host the ceremony. At his direction, the students, holding flowers, lined the halls to greet us as we entered the building. Talat-Kelpsha offered us frothy mugs of beer. We could hardly refuse, though it was not yet noon. Ray and I were led to his office, where he proudly showed us a thick scrapbook filled with articles about our illustrious ancestor. Many of the clippings included the familiar photograph of Jonas Noreka arrayed in his military uniform. We had seen this picture every day of our childhoods. I set down my beer to flip through the album's pages. The headlines were repetitive. Generolas Vetra, I want to die on February 16th. In memory of Generolas Vetra, a monument will stand in Shikone. The director, secretaries, teachers, and children all looked on as Ray and I perused the book. Our mother had similar scrapbooks of our grandfather, I told the director in our native tongue. He patted me on the back. I can imagine. I heard you were writing a book on Jonas Noreka, that you have taken over the task from your mother. How wonderful. How did you decide to name the school after him? I asked. He stroked his chin and answered, it was during a meeting of the county board. We wanted to pick a new name to replace the Russian one. Your grandfather's name surfaced immediately. Then abruptly, he pulled me and my brother aside. Lowering his voice, he confided, I got a lot of grief at first when we picked his name. The comment perplexed me, but all eyes were still upon me as if I were a great celebrity. I struggled to conceal my confusion. He was accused of being a Jew killer, whispered the director. My eyes met Ray's. He too was aghast. Accused of being a Jew killer? What could the director mean? Had we heard correctly? I studied his face for a moment, feeling off balance, then looked around the room at the teachers and others assembled. Who were all these people, and who was I? Or my mother? Or my grandmother? Or my grandfather? My mind whirled in disbelief. There must be some mistake. It can't be true. The director was still talking to me, but I couldn't hear him. I felt as if I were speaking from the other side of a long and winding tunnel. He clearly expected a response from me, but I was at a loss for words, or even for thought. I didn't want to have a conversation about the possibility that my grandfather was a Jew killer. It felt as if my brain were doing somersaults. As my legs seemed about to buckle, I grabbed a chair and plopped down heavily, breathing deeply to stop my heart from sprinting, every nerve in my body at military attention. So after that, I returned back to Chicago, and I started talking to people here, my father and other people, and I was asking them, have you ever heard of this crazy rumor about Jonas Noreka killing Jews? And everybody in my father's generation said, yeah, we heard this. And I'm like, what? And I'm like, how come nobody ever told me about it? And they're like, well, it's not true. Why would we talk about something that's not true? It's just communist propaganda. And, you know, the communists just don't want Lithuania to have any heroes, so they make up these crazy stories. And so for a long time, I felt the same thing because I was a Lithuanian in Chicago, and that's what everybody thought. And so in the meantime, I kind of, set that rumor to the side and I just worked on, I guess his heroic side, what I was calling his heroic side. I had read those 3,000 pages of transcripts and reread the 77 letters that he wrote to my grandmother from the Stutthof concentration camp and went through this whole archive behind me. And, I was a full-time journalist at the time, raising two young children. So this was kind of a side project. Um, but then eventually, the journalist in me kind of raised her head and said, you're not going to be able to ignore this rumor. You're going to have to address it. You can't just pretend it's not there. So I finally got my nerve up and decided to look into the Nazi occupation. And I had a little fantasy of hoping to exonerate my grandfather, laying this rumor to rest once and for all. In the meantime, I stopped my full-time career as being a journalist because I realized that I was writing for everybody else and had no time to write this story. And I became a high school teacher so that I could have my summers off to work on this book. And so this book was written mostly in the summers after I started teaching. One of the things that I found in my mom's archive was this brochure, and this is what it looks like. It's this size, and it was written by my grandfather, and he wrote it in 1933 at the age of 22 when he had just joined the Lithuanian army. And it's called Pakelk galva Lietuvi, which translates into Raise Your Head Lithuanian. This document was very troubling to me because I did not expect to read it. Again, this was something I knew nothing about, and it really did not make my grandfather look good because it showed how anti-Semitic he was. And this brochure has been called the Lithuanian Mein Kampf since then. I'm almost sure my grandfather must have read Hitler's Mein Kampf, which was written in 1926, and he wrote this 7 years later. And these are just 4 quotes. This is a 32-page booklet, and most of the booklet is like of this tone. And I just picked 4 quotes rather randomly. Jews in nice clothes sit in cafes thinking how to extract from us as much money as possible. The Jew gives you to earn, but he will find an opportunity to steal from you 3 times more once and forever. Do not buy anything from the Jews. Remember, when you sell a big thing to a Jew, you are doing harm. You are harming your brother, an ethnic Lithuanian. If all ethnic Lithuanians had an agreement to boycott the Jew, life would be much better. Yes, yes, indeed. So the full 32 pages is of this tenor. And of course, when I finished reading it as his granddaughter, I just wanted to burn it. I was very upset to have found it. And I really, kind of had a silent conversation with my grandfather at the time. And I said, this is not going to make it easy to exonerate you. You just made my life much harder. And, but I still had a tiny, tiny sliver of hope because he didn't call for the killing of Jews in here. He called for the boycotting of them economically. And I thought, well, this still doesn't prove that he wanted to kill them. I mean, as damaging as this document was. But of course, all my hopes were dashed when I came across this other document, also in my mom's archive, that he wrote when he was chairman of the Šiauliai district during the Nazi occupation. He officially took the job on August 5th, although unofficially, I think he took it in July of 1941. But anyway, he wrote this document already on August 22nd, 1941, calling for all Jews and half-Jews in his district of Šiauliai to be rounded up and brought to a ghetto that he wanted newly created in Žagarė, which was just north of Šiauliai. And within 6 weeks, More than 2,000 Jews were slaughtered and killed in that ghetto of Zagadeh, and on the date of Yom Kippur. And they ranged in age from babies to grandparents. So this is the document that really, really turned things around for me. And after this, I began to believe that this was much more than just a rumor and that he was really involved in the Holocaust. And I'm going to just read excerpts from this document because this document is so pivotal. And it's on page 109. And I reprint it there. And he says, by decree of Cholet District Commissioner, all citizens of Jewish ethnicity, including half Jews, must be removed from all principalities and towns of the county and settled in one district, the ghetto. All Jewish property must be preserved and accounted for by municipalities. In accordance with this decree, 1. Jews of all principalities, secondary towns, and townships must be moved to the town of Zagadeh in the period of the 25th to the 29th of this month. Requisites for resettlement will be provided by respective municipalities. 2. Lists of abandoned Jewish property must be delivered to me in 2 copies by August 29. Resettled Jews can take the most necessary household items and clothes and up to 200 Reichsmarks in cash for each Jewish family. 3. In Zagadeh, all Jews will be settled in a separate district, which has to be fenced off by August 30th. Fencing off the ghetto district will be taken care of by the Zagadeh municipality. Everyday district Jews in the ghetto will be conveyed to work and back to the ghetto by guards. 4. Non-Jewish citizens of the district appointed for the Jews are allowed to choose other locations in the county. If any of those non-Jews who are resettled have to abandon their real estate, they're allowed to choose real estate of corresponding value abandoned by the Jews in Zagadeh or other townships. 5. Chiefs and burgomasters are obliged to inform me on the execution of this decree by the 29th of this month, including information on what has been accomplished and how many Jews have been resettled. The burgomaster of Zagadeh must inform me how many Jews have been resettled to Zagadeh. So it's a primary source document. His signature is at the bottom, and the results are devastating of what happened to these Jews. So by 2013, I decided to go to Lithuania and spend 7 weeks researching for myself what happened. And I went in the summer of 2013, and I talked to a lot of people and did a lot of research. And when I came back from that trip, I had concluded that he had given orders to kill 2,000 Jews in Plunge by mid-July 1941, at least 2,000 in Tel Shay, and at least 4,000 in Cholet, for a total of 8,000 deaths under his watch. And this is a conservative number. Less conservative number is 15,000. So he would be considered a desk murderer because there's no evidence that he actually ever killed any Jews himself. And to Lithuanians in Lithuania, that is a really big distinction, as I'll explain later. So as part of my research, I hired a Holocaust guide. Before 2012, I didn't even know that there was such a thing as Holocaust guides in Lithuania. This was completely off my radar. But I had a friend who worked for the Sun-Times here in Chicago, Jewish, and he called me and he said, I just came back from a Holocaust tour in Lithuania. And I'm like, what's that? And he said, well, it's a thing that Jews do, who they hire a Holocaust guide and they ask this guy to take them to the places where he thinks or she thinks that their relatives may have been buried. And I'm like, oh my gosh, Howard, that sounds so sad. I can't believe you guys do this. And he said, yeah, it's what we do. And then we pray over where we think our relatives are buried. And I was very, very affected by this conversation. And a few days later, I called him back and I said, you know, Howard, I have this crazy idea. I think maybe I could hire your Holocaust guide and have him take me to places where I think my grandfather may have played a role in killing Jews. And he said, wow, Sylvia, that is a really crazy idea, but it's a good one. And so he contacted Simon Davidovich for me, who at that time was the director of Sugihara Museum in Kaunas. And at first, Simon didn't want to take me on this tour because he just thought it would be too uncomfortable for him to escort the granddaughter of a perpetrator. But he started researching more about my grandfather, Jonas Noreka, and he said he got so involved in this interesting character that he decided he wanted to meet me and he wanted to do this. And so he changed his mind. And so here he took me, this is the Holocaust Museum in Vilnius, and he took me there to learn more about the Holocaust in Lithuania. And we became very good friends on this trip and had spent quite a bit of time together. And I explain a lot about this in my book. He had died in the year 2015, though. He had become very sick, so he's no longer with us. He, under Simon's urging, he suggested I interview the director of the Genocide Museum because the Genocide Museum plays a very big role in the official history of Lithuania. This genocide Resistance and Research Center was created by the government of Lithuania to come up with the official narrative of what happened during World War II, essentially. And most of their time is dedicated to the Soviet occupation, which, you know, to be fair, Lithuania was occupied by the Soviets a lot longer than it was occupied by the Nazis. But it didn't, you know, this is the institution that decided my grandfather was a hero. They're the ones who basically gave the imprimatur that my grandfather should receive that Cross of the Vytis, that this plaque should be put up in Vilnius, that the school should be named after him. So it's because of this institution that my grandfather has been declared such a hero. And what I was discovering about my grandfather, of course, was very different than what this official institution with about 100 historians paid for by the government has come up with. So Simon thought I should interview the director. And I did. And so when I interviewed her, I asked her about that document that my grandfather signed on August 22nd, 1941, in which more than 2,000 Jews were murdered. And her response was just very strange to me at the time, but very indicative of kind of how this distortion continues. She said, it's hard to know what he really felt in his heart when he signed that document. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to move this. And anyway, I thought that that was a very strange response because, you know, when I went to journalism school at Northwestern, we were just taught to take things at face value, like his signature's at the bottom, it's a primary source document, the results are devastating. But here's the director of the Genocide Center, like falling all over herself, coming up with all kind of excuses for him that is nowhere in this document. She's just saying he must have really loved Jews. He must have been forced to sign this document. You know, all kinds of these suppositions coming up just to defend him. And that's how it is in Lithuania. Nobody can just take this, can just believe this of what happened. So what I discovered is that when he was head of the Cholet district from August 1941 to March 1943, he wrote about 1,000 orders. And 70 of those orders had to do with the Holocaust. And we could only find 3 of those orders originally written in German. So only 3 were translations, and the other 67 were written straight into Lithuanian. And this is a really important distinction because part of the defense is he was just following orders. He was just doing what the Germans were doing. But yet when we went through these documents, it really seemed very clear that he had a lot of agency and he was coming up with a lot of the decisions and a lot of the details of how this Holocaust should proceed in his district. So this idea of him being a desk murderer plays very prominently in Lithuania and contributes to this idea of Holocaust distortion. Essentially in Lithuania, if you were a Žydšaudis or a Jew shooter, that's the only one who's guilty. And nobody else is guilty. These Žydšaudžiai were very difficult to find, to get somebody to do this dirty work. Often they were drunk. You had to like bribe them with alcohol, and they were generally not well educated. And in general, every Lithuanian family has heard of a Žydšaudis, and if somebody was a Žydšaudis, they were shunned by the Lithuanian community. But the problem is that they're the last person in the genocide machine. And when I do my talks, sometimes with students, and I spoke with some Lithuanian teachers recently, I asked them, who is the guiltiest in this genocide machine? And I was trying to make the point that it wasn't just these last Jew shooters who did it. I mean, there's like a whole chain of events that happened before these Jews were shot, in front of the pits. Yes, Hitler and the Nazi propaganda starts at the top. Nothing would have happened without them. That's probably true. But then there was this Lithuanian provisional government, and they called for the cleansing of Jews. And there was the Lithuanian Activist Front, a group of militias, and they called for the cleansing of Jews. And my grandfather was part of that Lithuanian Activist Front. Then there were Nazi orders who they wrote orders to segregate and round up Jews. Then there were Lithuanians like my grandfather who translated those orders. Then there were Lithuanians who identified the Jews. Then there were Lithuanians who rounded up the Jews. Then there were Lithuanians who guarded Jews in the ghetto. Then there were Lithuanians who distributed the Jewish property. Then there were Lithuanians who took Jewish property. Then the Lithuanians who took Jews to the pit. Then finally, there were Lithuanians who shot the Jews. And so I put them in little groups and I asked them, who's the guiltiest in this? And of course, it doesn't take more than 2 minutes for everybody to say they're all guilty. It's not just the last person who did the shooting. They could have not have done that without the help of the rest of society. And so this is something that's new for Lithuanians to comprehend. It seems very obvious to American audiences, but in Lithuania, it's kind of a big distinction. So it took me 5 years to write the book. And by 2018, I pretty much had the book written. But then I met with Grant Goshen, and I had to rewrite the whole book again after I met him. The way that happened is I was looking for a literary agent at that time, and it became very clear after many, many rejections that I didn't have an author platform. I'm like, oh my gosh, what's an author platform? So this is where you're supposed to have an audience following so that a publisher thinks they can sell your book. And so I had to start building up an author platform. And step one in that apparently is get a website up. So I got a website up, And I got my website up in March 2018. And within days, a researcher contacts me from Lithuania. He was working for this Grant Goshen, and he says that Grant Goshen lost about 100 relatives in the Holocaust because of Jonas Noreika. And Grant Goshen launched a lawsuit against the Genocide Research Center because that center has been defending the good name of Jonas Noreika. And he was suing them essentially for Holocaust distortion. And he had, so what's interesting is Grant has been working on researching my grandfather, for at least a decade. And where I had been researching my grandfather for almost 2 decades, and neither one of us had met yet. And by this point, we met, and we started sharing information with each other. And I gave him my manuscript, and he gave me all the research he found about Jonas Noreika. And then after he gave me all his research, I had to do a massive rewrite of my manuscript again. And he sort of had to, update his own research that he was submitting to the Lithuanian courts. Anyway, he went through all the courts of Lithuania and lost. And then he filed in the European Court of Human Rights, and that institution did not accept his case. They're like the Supreme Court here, where they just don't accept, more than 95% of the cases. So they just did not accept it to even look at it. And now he submitted something into the United Nations. Grant and I have since become very good friends. And I think the combination of us two together has received we've both been receiving a lot of publicity, I think, as a result. And I did want to read one excerpt on page 9 that was part of the response to his lawsuit that he submitted in Lithuania about the Genocide Center. And I included these excerpts in between all my chapters to kind of demonstrate how this Holocaust distortion works in Lithuania. So this is the Genocide Center's response, an excerpt of the Genocide Center's response to his lawsuit. And this is, of course, after I had shared all my information with him. Vilnius, October 1st, 2018. The Genocide Center would like to call the court's attention to the fact that S. Foti, living in the United States, was not a participant in the historical events in question. She was not yet born, nor is she a professional historian. Her opinion about her grandfather is directly opposed to her mother's, Jane Noreika's daughter. One can conclude from the published research of S. Foti that she's not familiar with the accepted methodology of historical research, such as that conducted by academic historians, which requires deep critical analysis within a proper historical framework. Vilnius Regional Administrative Court, file number EL 4215-281, 2018. Response from the Genocide Resistance and Research Center to the prosecution's claim against the Genocide Center's refusal to change its historical conclusion on Jonas Noreika. So I'm nearing the end of my presentation. I just want to share some numbers. There have been at least 900 Lithuanians who saved Jews, according to the righteous at Yad Vashem. They have come up with 900 Lithuanians who saved Jews. And in the Lithuanian community, every Lithuanian has some family member apparently who played a role in saving Jews. This is a big thing that I've heard often. But I have been pushing back and saying that while 900 Lithuanians saved Jews, unfortunately 2.99 million did not. And this is where the big problem came up with. And one of the latest things is that the Genocide Center had a historian 1 or 2 years ago who came up with some information that said my grandfather helped to save Jews. Of course, there's no names of those Jews, But this is what they're doing. They're doing everything they can to save my grandfather's reputation. So in 2019, that plaque that I talked about earlier, uh, this Stanislavas Tomas was running for the European Parliament from Lithuania, and he decided to smash the plaque. So he got up. Sometimes I show a little video of this, but it often doesn't work on these presentations. But anyway, you can find him on YouTube, and you can see how he gets up on that little ladder, and he takes a sledgehammer, and 14 times, it takes 14 times till that thing falls, and it finally falls into pieces. And he was arrested, and then he had to flee Lithuania, and I think he went to the Philippines or something like that just to escape. And what happened after that? Lithuanians doubled down, and they put up a brand new plaque. So it's bigger and better than the old one. And this is the new plaque there on that building. So that's how that went. So anyway, Lithuania could be said to be in the 10th stage of genocide. There are 10 stages of genocide, according to Dr. Gregory Stanton of Genocide Watch, who created these stages. And the last stage is denial that it ever happened. And this is the narrative, that Lithuanians had nothing to do with killing Jews, that it was all the German Nazis. And yes, maybe there were a few degenerate Lithuanians who shot some Jews, but everybody else is completely innocent, including my grandfather. So anyway, my book has gotten, the story has gotten a lot of international coverage. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Chicago Tribune, Der Spiegel, Salon.com, BBC. The book first came out in Spanish with HarperCollins Mexico in 2020. And then it came out with Regnery History, March 2021. And now this has given me a lot of hope. It's coming out Lithuanian essentially next week by Kitos Knygos, which translates into other books. And the title is Vetra Lieto Shalia, or Storm in the Land of Rain. And I'll be traveling to Lithuania and presenting this book at the Vilnius Book Fair on February 26th. It's also coming out in Polish and Hungarian. I'm hearing the Polish version will come out in April. Hungarian, I still don't have a date. And the paperback is coming out in June 7th, 2022, and it is called Storm in the Land of Rain. A mother's dying wish becomes her daughter's nightmare. So that's what that's going to be like. And that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Sylvia, so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I cannot imagine all that you went through as you were going through this, on this journey, learning about your grandfather. I'd like to open it up if anyone has some questions and would like to enter them in the chat. Sylvia would be more than happy to clarify something, to answer a question. I'll give people a few minutes to enter something. If not, I'm sure I can come up with a question. I have a gazillion questions. I would imagine, many others do too. So, and I will read the questions in the chats as they come through. Yes, absolutely. People on the phone, yes, please, if you're on the phone and you have a question, Tam will unmute you and you can chime in. And one question for Doretta, saying, what a roller coaster of emotions. How do you feel about all of this now? And another question, how do your other family members,
that's what I was wondering,
feel about all of this coming to light? You mentioned a brother. Do you have cousins? Do that, their uncles or aunts? How do they feel about this?
Well, I guess I'll start with the first question. It has been a roller coaster of emotions. I have gone from denial to depression to bargaining to anger, and then finally now I'm at acceptance. Um, and at this point, I would say it's very cathartic for me to be talking about this. I think for me and for many Lithuanians, it's traumatic to own up to the idea that your relatives played a role, were perpetrators in the Holocaust. Um, and that has been very, very difficult for me to wrap my head around, but I've had a long time in doing that. And most Lithuanians, with my book out, have only had like 1 or 2 years to think about it. And most of them are still in that denial stage. And I kind of get it because I went through that. I'm sort of very patient in understanding at least the Lithuanian point of view, because I understand how hard it was for me. And I think it's going to be hard for just about anybody else who's of Lithuanian descent. So, in my own family, my brother, thank God, has been very, very supportive. So, he was there when I first heard that, terrible rumor. And he lives in California and I'm in Chicago. And we talk very frequently. And he read, God bless him, almost all of my drafts, which numbers about 100. So he's read them all and has been very supportive about it. Um, my father was very uncomfortable about all this. He wished that I did not write it. He remarried, and his new wife also was very uncomfortable about it, and wished that I wouldn't write it. But my father read the book, he said, twice this year, and after the second time he read it, he said, Sylvia, maybe you're onto something. So, so I think I finally converted my father, but my mom was an only child, so there no other relatives there on her end. Um, I do have relatives in Lithuania, and most of them who I visited in 2013, I was very open about, I'm investigating what my grandfather did as far as killing Jews. And they were very open and friendly with me, but I don't think they thought the book would get this big. And now that it's gotten this big, they're very upset with me because I guess they just think, I'm a traitor. And in general, those who don't know me, I'm getting the cold shoulder from the Lithuanian community here in Chicago. They just wish the story would go away. Um, so I have gotten a death threat or two. I didn't take it too seriously, but it was not fun to get anyway. And a lot of hate mail. That is true. Lots of hate mail on Facebook, but thank God Facebook has this block feature. So that's how I take care of that. And
Oh, Sylvia, you're muted. There we go.
okay. All right.
You're back.
All right.
We're getting a bunch more questions. Two people have asked similar questions. Are you worried about your reception when you go back to Lithuania? Including, are you worried for your own safety when you go back to Lithuania?
Well, I went in October, and in October I was invited by the Olga Lengyel Institute to talk about my findings from this book to 30 teachers who teach about the Holocaust in their own classrooms, and most are high school teachers. So I was really nervous in October, and it turned out all my fears were unfounded. Everything turned out fine. I was a little under the radar at the time. I think I'll be more public this time when I go because it's this Vilnius book fair and there's been some publicity about my book already in Lithuania. So I'm a little nervous, but everybody assures me that the worst that will happen is, some heckling or some hate, but that my life will be fine. So that's what I'm telling
Okay, good
myself.
to
Like
know, right?
I don't think I'll be assassinated, but the thought is crossing my mind. What can I
Oh,
say?
goodness. And just anyone who's on the phone who does have a question, my instructions are to have you press 6 if you would like to speak, and that way you'll be able to speak without everybody being unmuted. And one more question asking, is there a large Jewish population in Lithuania now? And I would tack on to that question, how has the Jewish population in Lithuania reacted to your book?
There's a very, very small Jewish population, less than 3,000 out of 2.5 million. So many Jews that I've met who had relatives murdered in the Holocaust have very mixed feelings about going back to Lithuania. Some are going back, but many have terrible memories passed down to them of what happened. Um, but the Jews in Lithuania have embraced me. You know, they're very happy that I'm coming out with the story. They have not met many Lithuanians willing to own up to what their relatives did during the Holocaust. Um, you know, part of the problem is that Lithuania was occupied by the Soviet Union right after the Holocaust. And when you're occupied by the Soviet Union, you don't get to think what you want to think. It's not like here in America. So the Soviet Union basically gets to decide how Lithuania will think about things. And they said that Soviet citizens were murdered. They didn't even separate them as Jews were murdered. So all of like even the Soviet Union sort of covered it up by just calling them Soviet citizens. And so that played a big role in covering up the whole thing too. And so when Lithuania got its freedom again, you know, 50 years later, it's like Lithuania was in a deep freeze over its history, and it's only now kind of coming out of it, you know, more than 30 years later. So people are finally starting to talk about what happened during the Holocaust, but it's still a rather slow process.
And I just, another shout out to those on the phone, apparently press *6. I got it wrong the first time. If you do want to speak on the phone, to please press *6. And we have another question. Do you wonder, does this story, you know, that you learned about sort of the covering up or the revision of your grandfather's history, does this make you wonder if there are other issues or other places where things have been covered up or revised historically?
Oh, I'm sure they have. I mean, I think it's a thing. It's even here in our own country, in the United States, you know. It's so easy to see it in somebody else's country, I think. So, and it's very difficult to see it, you know, in our own. So I would say this is done all the time. This is done all the time. But I also, you know, as a pushback, if a European country can cover up what happened in a genocide, what chance does, you know, anybody have in Africa, in the Middle East, where genocides are even occurring today? So I think I'm hoping that Lithuania will change its narrative the way Germany did. Germany owned up to it, and I'm hoping Lithuania will follow suit.
And one more question's just come in. Do you think your journey and book will inspire people in other countries to examine their family members? And has anyone contacted you about that? Do you know of anyone else going, you know, undertaking a similar journey, looking at their own family?
I hope so. I don't know. You know, it's such a constellation of factors that happened. Just a lot of luck. You know, as far because I fell into this story, I would have never pursued it if my mom didn't ask me to. And then if I, you know, I was a journalist, so that made a big difference too. And he's my grandfather, and my grandfather left a long paper trail, which not a lot of these people did because he was head of that Cholet district. So uh, in other cases, my grandfather's not even the worst Holocaust perpetrator. And people have said that to me. And I'm like, well, I understand that, but none of them are my grandfather. And that's why I kind of don't care as deeply about them. Like, I kind of jumped into this because it was my grandfather. So it's possible this could happen somewhere else. There are many more Holocaust perpetrators that are in formerly Soviet occupied countries. That is true. That is true. That this is a phenomenon, and I didn't know that even until I met Grant. I thought my grandfather was like kind of an exception, but this is like a thing with all these Eastern European countries. He's kind of a lightning rod for this issue for all of these countries.
And one more question has come in. Do you think your mother knew the real story and that maybe this was why she asked you to pursue it?
I ask myself this question all the time. She was only 2 years old in 1941, so I do believe my grandmother knew because she was his wife, and it was 1941, and she was an adult woman. I think anyone who was an adult in 1941 could see what was happening. But my mom, I think, must have just heard the rumor and then went into denial. I think that's as far as she ever got. And maybe she was going to try to exonerate him. But I don't think she could have ever faced this. I really don't think she could have ever faced this.
Any other questions that people have? I would invite you to take advantage of having a wonderful speaker with a wonderful story. And certainly, Sylvia, I know you can scroll through the chat as well, but there's also been wonderful, lovely messages just about how wonderful a presentation this has been, how much
Oh,
people, yeah. So please do also scroll through and see all of those messages. Yes, with people wishing you a safe trip to Lithuania. And I do hope I've read the book. So I would encourage everybody to read it. It really is an absolutely fascinating story. And so I think, yep. Why was it published in Mexico first? That is a good question. I was curious about that.
I was really shocked when we got the offer from Mexico. I'm like, Mexico, but apparently there's a large Jewish population in Mexico, and which I was not aware of. So I think it was because of that.
Okay, well then, I would say thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you, Sylvia, so very, very much for being our first ever distinguished lecturer in our new distinguished lecture series. I think this is a wonderful way to open up the series. I would also like to invite everybody, please, we have another speaker in March and yet another speaker in April, to please continue coming. And wish everybody a very wonderful evening and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.